My mum's name's Sue Jupp. Yeah, so my mum, she was a nurse when she was younger, quite a inspirational person to most people who met her, mainly because of who she was and her personality. She was always interested in everyone. She had a naughty glint in her eyes all the way through. She was cheeky and funny. But I think one of the defining sort of aspects of her is that my mum was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy at the age of 21, which is a progressive illness, neurological illness. So by the 90s, she was wheelchair bound. It didn't define my mum being disabled. And that was the most inspirational thing, that nothing really stopped either my mum or my dad in what they wanted to do in their lives. So they adapted. So she was able to carry on nursing. When I was a child, she was a night nurse at Cookfield Hospital. So she continued nursing, and it was a large part of who her identity was. She was involved in all sorts of different things, really to improve the community. So she was involved in a disability advice line, giving support to other disabled people around their rights. She did things to improve Lindfield Village, like planting trees, lowering the curbs before anyone else was lowering the curbs for disabled people. Was a big book club person with all her friends. I think they drank and ate and chatted more than they read. But she was very full of lots of things going on in her life. As a family, we lived abroad and travelled. So despite mum being disabled, we lived in Tehran and things. So it was like quite an interesting life my mum led, really. And I think for me, one of the stories that sort of sums up my parents' way of dealing with having muscular dystrophy within the family is that they decided to go to Greece. And my dad always used to, whenever we faced any building that was inaccessible, he would just throw mum over his shoulder and walk up. And he did it at the Acropolis, and he carried my mum all the way up to the top of the Acropolis with everyone applauding, with my mum laughing all the way. So it kind of sums them up of who they were and how they took on life. We knew what mum's view was on what she wanted for the end of her life. She was adamant that she would never go into hospital because generally hospital care isn't really set up for someone who's severely disabled. And by the time my mum was in her later years of her life, she was immobile. So it was hoists and everything were used, and we had a team of carers. They all knew how to care for my mum, and so did we, whereas going into hospital would have actually probably caused more pain and discomfort than being at home. So she was really adamant she was not going to be in hospital. Unfortunately, we did end up in hospital a couple of times at the end, but she had a living will for years and a do not resuscitate. So she didn't want any interventions that would extend life but not extend or enhance quality of life. And we're quite open. I think when you live with disability, you talk about health and life and well-being probably more than possibly if you're in a family that's not been touched by something like that. Certainly my mum was very pro-hospice and particularly supported St Peter and St James's Hospice, and a number of her friends had spent time and had died at the hospice, and so she knew that would be an option for her. But at the very end, when mum ended up in hospital, and it was a very fast, sort of sudden change in her disability. So she could no longer swallow or eat, and her movement was really declining. Initially, she refused any further intervention and wanted to go home, and we were going to do hospice at home. And it was such a moment for us because the ambulance arrived, the stretcher was there, they were literally walking into the ward, and my mum changed her mind. My mum could do, and suddenly realised that she didn't fully trust us as her family and carers and friends to manage everything fully, and felt that actually she wanted to be in the hospice with teams of nurses, those who knew, and her family there, rather than she just suddenly got panicked about going home. I was so impressed with the fact that that was all facilitated for us. People weren't pressurizing us. That decision was completely led by my mum, and everyone respected it. And I think for me, looking back at the experience, the hospital, there was a sense that mum's time was very short, and we even might not possibly make it to the hospice. And I think that's nothing against the hospital, but the hospital's very much about fix you and get you out. They're about sorting the short-term problem. And they were brilliant, and we were with a fantastic team there. And then when we came to the hospice, it was so remarkably different. It was calm, it was contained. It felt like everybody knew exactly what was doing. No one was frightened of anything. Everybody understood that we as a family knew a lot about how to care for my mum and move my mum and how to make her very comfortable. You've been kind of enveloped with all that sort of comfort and calmness that I think immediately my mum relaxed. She lived another 10 days rather than a day or two that the hospital had been thinking that she would survive for. So I just think that peace, tranquility and expertise all coming together, that sort of personalized and professional help all at once, relaxed my mum. And actually her life was really peaceful and loving. On one of the days, mum asked to go into the sun. It was the day before that big storm that came. It was a hot sunny day. So the team rolled mum out onto the patio outside her window through the French doors, and she just sort of lay there and basked in the sun, and it was lovely. And you wouldn't get that anywhere else, really. No, the team were there. They held you and gave you the kind of the time that you needed. They answered all the questions. Some of the questions were sort of you're a bit frightened to ask. They were open to being asked the questions and answered them really kindly but honestly about the truth of no one can really predict what's going to happen. Everybody's different, and those answers can be a bit vague, but it was done with so much assurance that actually it wasn't vague, it was supportive, because that's the truth. There isn't a predictable way for someone's end of life to happen. And the numbers of nurses and support that was there, all of which was excellent, some of which were phenomenal, in particular Nicola and Lucy, who were there on the last night with me and my mum, were amazing in their support. What would be fantastic if we could replicate that level of care, support and patient-centred focused care into the full NHS would be incredible. If that could be the standard that everybody could experience in normal healthcare where you're trying to get better, as well as healthcare where you're helping someone come to the end of their life. I just thought it was, I'm a huge fan, basically, of all that the hospice does. I feel very strongly that we need to feel able, and we help people feel able to talk about end of life and plan for our own end of, our own dying, and what we would like to happen, both how we want to die and then also what happens after we've died. And that's how my mum lived her life, knowing that her end of life would be sooner than she would have hoped it to be. And if she hadn't have had muscular dystrophy, she would have been a fit and healthy woman. I think, this campaign around Dying Matters is really important, because it helps people talk about their experiences of others and their loved ones that have died, but also helps people think about what they want to have happen, and empowers people, therefore, to hopefully get access or find a way to have access to a good death. And that hopefully is with the hospice, is if able to get access. I think it would be great if more people could get more access to time in a hospice or their end of life at a hospice.